This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. One of the things that happened just recently, under the shadow of the impeachment discussion, was that Trump gave a speech at the United Nations. And that speech, I think, bears some consideration. He took at least 5, maybe 10 minutes to berate China. And it was a fierce attack upon China. So if you have the idea that this will all blow over with China, I think you should pay attention to what he said in that speech. Basically, he painted a picture of China as being a pariah in the global system, a pariah and a predator within the global economic system. And in particular, it was a predator vis-a-vis the United States. And one of the main things, of course, was that China was destroying the international order and the coherence of the international order by its interventions, and in particular, its attack, as it were, upon intellectual property rights and its attempt to steal intellectual property rights from the rest of the world was something that was nefarious and something that was completely illegal and completely wrong. Now, I think that it's important to understand why it is that Trump is going after China. And I would like to tie this to something he said, which I think is extremely illuminating. He said at a certain point that there were two main enemies of the United States in the world right now. One was Xi Jinping, and the other was Jay Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, what does this tell you? What this tells you is that Trump is focusing on China and the Federal Reserve as enemies of the United States. Why is he doing that? I think the answer to that is that there is in his mind, and I think among many people right now, a kind of nervousness about where the economy is going. Is it going in a good direction or a bad direction? And there's a lot of sense that maybe it's not going in a good direction. For example, even when companies are flush with money, as General Motors is, and as we know, what General Motors does, even though it's flush with money, is to close plants down, like Lordstown and a couple of other plants. So companies that are flush with money are not spending it. They're actually, if anything, buying back their own stock. So there's a sense that something not quite right in the capitalist economy. And I think what Trump is doing is to recognize that if the economic situation is not good in 2020, it's almost impossible for him to get re-elected. I mean, he may not be re-elected for other reasons, and he may get impeached en route, but, he's thinking about 2020 and the election. What would he do, and how would he explain to people that the economy is not doing very well? Because he has been saying that the economy is doing well right now because of him. Actually, it hasn't been doing well because of him. It's been doing well because it's been doing well. And he's actually, if anything, he's messing things up rather than actually making them go better. But nevertheless, the economy is okay right now. But it seems like it's fragile. It seems like people are nervous about it's going to do something and all the rest of it. And I think Trump shares that. So if the economy really goes under in the next year or so, how would he explain it to people? Well, he'll explain it to you by saying, look, we were doing fine. The problem is, and I was doing fine. I was doing a perfect management of the American economy and making America great again. But there are two big enemies that stopped me. The two big enemies were China by its policies and by its nefarious practices, and the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve refused to cut interest rates, and therefore the Federal Reserve is to blame. Now, this is the interesting thing about politicians. When the economy is booming, they love to say they're totally in control and it's in 100% due to them. When the economy crashes, they say, this has nothing to do with me. I was doing everything fine, but there's something outside which has stopped me. And these are the enemies of the people, China and Federal Reserve. Now, I'm not so worried about him talking about the Federal Reserve in the way he talks about the Federal Reserve. I mean, it's obviously wrong, and I think a lot of people will immediately see that this is kind of, not really feasible, except, some people in the economic base. The difficulty is with his attack upon China, because he shares something here with the Democrats. It's not as if Chuck Schumer is friendly about China. Chuck Schumer is as antagonistic to China as anybody else. A large chunk of the Democratic Party and the union movement and all the rest of it can be persuaded that China is the problem. China is the big problem. And I think that we have to deal with a serious attempt on Trump's part to keep the antagonism with China up front. For instance, over the last year, we've had all of this tariff stuff, and Trump kind of says, okay, I think we're on the way to solve it, and the markets sort of go up, and then it turns out he hasn't solved it, and there's another problem, and the markets go down, and I sometimes suspect that he's got some secret fund way over the horizon that he kind of says, hey, I'm about to say some nasty things about the tariffs, and so get ready, and you either hedge it downwards or you hedge it upwards. I mean, somebody somewhere might be making a lot of money on somebody's behalf by just waiting for Trump to give a pronouncement that today says everything looks okay with China, so the market shoots up, and then 5 days later he says, well, we've hit this thing and China is terrible, and the market shoots down. So so there may be something of that kind, but the antagonism with China is, I think, going to be a real problem. And it's going to be a real problem for a number of reasons. One is that the Chinese economy is itself undergoing some pretty difficult readjustments. Readjustments from very high rates of growth to much lower rates of growth, which to some degree is offset by the fact that the mass of the Chinese economy is now much bigger than it was, say, 20 years ago. And when I like to talk about the relationship between rates and masses, I would point out that China, with a 5 or 6% rate of growth in last year or two, created something like $1.2 trillion of new business, which is twice as much as it created maybe 20-odd years before, when it had 12% rates of growth. So the mass of the Chinese economy is seriously changing much of the calculation. So this is a very interesting kind of moment. But the mass of the Chinese economy is such that there needs to be some readaptation within China away from dependence upon U.S. consumer markets and dependence upon U.S. trade. Now, it so happens that the crisis of 2007-2008, which crashed the U.S. consumer market, also crashed the China export market. And so China went through this huge kind of readjustment around that time. But the access to the U.S. consumer market never recovered. In other words, the export industries accounted for, 20 or 30% of Chinese GDP or something of that kind before 2007, 2008. That was cut in half during the crisis, but it's never revived back to its pre-crisis levels. So China is less and less dependent upon the U.S. consumer market. The big question then is, where is China going to find its alternative market? Well, part of it is that China is, of course, exploring markets all around the world. And so if you look at the data on Chinese penetration of foreign markets, you find throughout Africa and increasingly in Latin America, China has become a huge sort of supplier of consumer goods to those markets. So there has been a movement of that kind. But the big issue for China is, can you actually create an internal market? And the internal market has been very dynamic. But the internal market in China has been supported by a huge increase in credit creation. And a huge increase in credit creation, but also credit creation to do what? Buy houses. And so actually this vast investment in construction and infrastructures, and particularly housing infrastructures, needs somebody to buy it. And so you start to supply credit to a middle class that then buys it. But then it's not only that, you're going to find that the classic US way of dealing with crises was to build houses and fill them with things, and also build houses in suburban locations so that actually everybody had to have an automobile. So the automobile market in China has also become a very serious thing. And the result of that is that the China's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions have shot up hugely. So China's response, I think, to what the US is doing is to say the US is cutting itself off to us as a consumer market. What that means is that we have to pursue consumer markets elsewhere, but also we have to pursue mass consumerism inside of China as well as outside of China. And that has consequences, both environmental, but also social and political, in terms of how China is going to develop over the next 10 or 15 years. So that China is in a difficult transition moment where it's also going through a transition from labor-intensive forms of production to capital-intensive forms of production. Now, one of the things which I have mentioned in previous podcasts is that labor-intensive industries do not actually gain the benefit of their labor intensity because there is a transfer of value from labor-intensive industries to capital-intensive industries, so that the capital-intensive centers of the world are those which actually end up, through free trade and the equalization of the profit rate, receiving more value than they actually produce. So there's a bias which exists within the capitalist system, which is actually a bias towards capital intensity. Now, China has been labor-intensive. So, in effect, labor intensity in China has been supporting the centers of capital intensity, so that there's been a subtle, if you like, transfer of value from China to the United States through the free market system and the equalization of the rate of profit. So that structure is now going to be intervened in by China actually moving towards capital intensity production. In this, China is actually doing something which has historically always taken place. For example, the whole Asiatic organization of capitalism. Japan starts with labor-intensive production and then moves to capital-intensive production. South Korea started with labor-intensive production, moves to capital-intensive. Taiwan started with labor-intensive and moved to capital-intensive. Singapore is perhaps one of the most interesting cases, because Singapore, when it was cut off from Malaysia, was faced with the problem. What kind of industrialization would it engage in? And it looked around and it saw Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong was labor-intensive activities, and Singapore was the one place that said, we don't want labor-intensive production. We want capital-intensive production. And from the very get-go, they tried to orchestrate Singapore as a center of capital-intensive activity. And look what happened. Singapore shoots up into per capita income, becomes one of the wealthiest sort of city-states around. And of course, Japan and Taiwan and South Korea did the same thing. So China looks at this history and says, well, that's a good idea. So we're going to do that. And they also recognize that the labor-intensive stuff has a limited life for a very interesting reason, which is that the huge reserves of labor, which China has typically disposed of over the last 15 or 20 years, are drying up because in 1980, China adopted a one-child per family policy. And the result of that is that the vast labor resources which existed there are effectively drying up because of the one-child policy. Now, recently, China has said, okay, we're going to relax the one-child policy. We're going to go, oh, you can have as many kids as you want. But actually, the Chinese middle class and the Chinese population says no. For a very interesting reason, because it now knows very, very well from the one-child experience that if you have one child, you can actually pay for the education of that one child, and that one child will likely then have a transition into the middle class. And so it's the dream of all peasant societies to take their one child and get them a good education, which has to be paid for even at the local level and kindergarten level, right the way through up to the university level, that you pay for them so that they can actually get into the technocratic middle class, of which there is a very significant growth of that class, of course, over time. So actually, even though they release the restriction over the one-child policy, most families don't want to do it. And of course, the changing position of women in society is such that they don't want to do it. And so actually, the demographics in China are such as to make it impossible to think about really maintaining labor-intensive forms of production. But for other reasons, they were moving out of labor-intensive forms of production also. And one of the consequences, and this is kind of interesting, of Trump's tariff policy is to make labor-intensive production for export to the United States less and less attractive. So Chinese firms, rather than deal with that, are actually migrating to Vietnam or to Cambodia or to Laos or even to Bangladesh. So that the labor-intensive forms of production are being moved out. This is creating some very interesting kind of problems for a country like Vietnam, because Vietnam, I think, recognizes that labor-intensive industrialization is not the most favorable form of industrialization that you can adopt. So Vietnam has been resisting the arrival of Chinese firms which are in textiles and clothing and all those kinds of labor-intensive sectors, mainly to kind of say, okay, well, we'll be very happy to bring in electronics because electronics can create the basis for, ultimately, for some more capital-intensive kind of production. So China then is in that situation. And interestingly, I think that the U.S. tariff policy towards China is such as to actually augment what the Chinese are doing already. Now, when you have big transitions in society, which are planned transitions, in the Chinese case, they are sort of planned for in the 5-year programs and all the rest of it. When you have a planned transition of this kind, we really need time for adjustment. And what the Trump's tariff policy has done is to accelerate, if you like, the way in which the plan. So it's going to be disruptive for China in the short run, but in the long run, I don't see that Trump's tariff policies are going to do anything other than actually facilitate China moving in the direction it was moving in anyway. In other words, it's giving China an extra push to go towards capital-intensive kinds of production. Now, here comes the interesting thing. Of course, capital-intensive forms of production depend upon high technology, depends upon the kinds of technologies that Trump is saying China has been stealing from the United States. But here's an interesting little piece of history. Japan took U.S. technologies in its industrialization. The United States did not object. And in fact, the United States was encouraging Japan to take U.S. technologies. It encouraged South Korea to take U.S. technologies. It encouraged Taiwan to take U.S. technologies. It encouraged Singapore to take U.S. technologies. So the U.S., as a center of technological excellence, was actually complicitous in the transfer of technology to all of those Asiatic countries. And there's an interesting question, why? The answer was China. The U.S. was so fearful of China and Chinese development that it wanted to create an arc of containment of China so that China could not really compete. And so it allowed the technologies to flow to all of those countries so that you created an arc of capitalist development around China during the Maoist period, which would actually contain China. Now, this goes back to what happened after the founding of the People's Republic of China, and 70 years ago now, the 70th anniversary of that's just coming up, and what the response of the U.S. was containment, and that is you had to support the economies all around China so that China could not actually spread outwards. And the only way you could contain them was by actually liberating the flow of technology and ideas to all of those countries. So all of those countries became centers of innovation of their own right. So, Taiwanese firms, South Korean firms, so on, we turn up and what do we see? We see Samsung, we see all these corporations, which are Asiatic corporations. And the Asiatic corporations, of course, have taken the technology from the United States and actually, to some degree, returned the technology to the United States because there's been a free flow, as it were, of technology. I mean, there were periods of argument and all the rest of it. But basically, the U.S. was encouraging all of those countries to move from labor-intensive forms of production to higher order so that none of them would be tempted to side with China. And China would not have any kind of credibility, given its economic development, with any of those countries. So that now you have a situation, however, in which China has actually started to follow the path of, if you were a Chinese policymaker, who would you want to follow? Would you want to follow the United States? Would you want to follow Brazil? No, you want to follow Japan, and you want to follow South Korea, and you want to follow Taiwan, and you see what they've done, and you say, okay, that's what we can do. And in fact, I really think the big model for China is Singapore. And that at some point or other, China wants to be like a huge version of Singapore. And I think there are elements of what's going on inside of China which point in that direction. But now the United States wants to stop that. But the interesting thing is that in a sense, the United States is too late, because actually in the 1990s there was a situation where many of the major corporations in the world were starting to transfer their research and development divisions to China, because they were beginning to find an educated labor force which could be employed and do a lot of the research. And you could also do it in a place where the social constraints on what you did experimentally with populations were very, very low. So you had a new drug you wanted to try out, you could try it in China and nobody was going to bother you too much. You had new technologies of communication, you could try them out and this kind of stuff. And what's more, you have a mass market now where you can experiment with artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence really depends on huge data sets. The Chinese have huge data sets. In fact, probably they have the most sophisticated data sets in the world. They have the possibility of developing artificial intelligence and activities and so on far more so than the United States, because the barriers to it and the social and the political barriers and a compliant population and all the rest of it is a situation in China where you can really set things up. So things change dramatically in China. For instance, 4 years ago when I first spent a month in Nanjing, the world was very, very different from what it was last time I was in Nanjing. For example, artificial intelligence and coordination of everything by phone apps and all the rest of it The Chinese are now living on, a lot of middle-class Chinese are now living on takeout foods. I mean, this sounds a bit like a joke that the Chinese are living off Chinese takeout, but in effect, there's a huge expansion of the logistics of providing food through, by takeout structures. It wasn't really there about 4 or 5 years ago, but now it's become very, very common. The Chinese now pay more and more by phone apps. Last time I was there, I found it a little difficult to pay with cash because everybody used a phone. Which actually turned out to be my advantage because I was fumbling around with cash and somebody would take a phone and say, "Oh, come off it." And so everybody was paying for me because I was so hindered by the fact I was trying to pay with cash. So China has these possibilities. And so China is developing in a certain kind of way. And I think one of the things I'm nervous about in relationship to what Trump is up to is that he is going to prolong this contest with China up until the election, if he can get to the election, that is. And to the degree that he gets the election, he's going to then fight the election on the systematic idea that there is a downturn in the economy. And of course, he's going to blame the Federal Reserve, but it's primarily to do with China, and that the United States has to fight fiercely with China and be as conflictual with China and try to do as much as it can to block China's form of development. What happens in China is to some degree going to be contingent upon what happens in the United States. And I think what happens to China is actually a critical thing for thinking about the future of humanity in terms of the environment and all of these other kinds of questions. And that therefore, there should be a situation of negotiation with China about how its developmental practices and its development process might work in a collaborative form, because the Chinese are capable of coming up with solutions to problems and management structures for contradictions, which are way ahead of anything that exists here. And my worry is that by insisting upon an antagonistic approach to China, Trump will not only antagonize China, he will also mobilize a large segment of the Democratic Party, a large segment of the U.S. working class, behind the idea that the problem in the world is not capitalism, the problem in the world is China, and that China must be taken down. And if you try to take down China, you're going to do something that's very, very, very dangerous. And that is why I think that I'm very, very concerned about the run-up to the next election, because Trump knows perfectly well that the economic base of the Democratic Party, part of it is willing to be instructed that the problem is China. And we have to fight very much against that, which is not to say I'm going to be pro-Chinese and the Chinese are lovely or anything of that kind. No, I think that there's a serious issue here that we should not, under any circumstances, take this anti-China kind of position automatically and start to work at it, because conflict with China is not in the world's best interest right now. But Trump is going to foment it as much as he can before the next election, with a good deal of assistance from large segments of the Democratic Party. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.